Hello, this is JD Stevens, and I want to welcome you to the Young Writers Hymn Writing Series. In this lesson, we are going to follow up on our last lesson on poetic language and discuss a few more points related to selecting the words to use in our song. This lesson is a bit of a smattering of different topics that relate to selecting words or word choice, so we'll just jump right into them. Our first topic is contractions. Should we use contractions, or how should we use contractions in writing a song? One benefit of contractions, and something that might draw us to using them, is that they are space efficient. They combine multiple words and multiple parts of speech into fewer syllables. So if we're really trying to squeeze in a whole thought into a line, they can be useful for that. Contractions, by their nature, though, in our English language, are used in less formal writing and speech. So you want to be sure that you're okay with the consequences of that for your song's tone and style when you decide to use contractions. Contractions will give a song more of a personal or intimate feeling versus a reverent feeling, where the speech may be more formal, or we may sort of spell everything out more. That being said, not all contractions are the same. If you use I'll or you'll, those have a softer feel as a contraction. They don't feel as informal. And you might find them in songs. Just flipping through your hymnal, you'll find them in songs that aren't particularly informal or intimate feeling. So let's say you're writing a song that is set in the scene is set in the throne room of God, and it's a very reverent and awe-filled scene. That doesn't mean that all contractions are off limits for that song. I'll and you'll might fit there, whereas some other contractions may not fit as well, or maybe just push your song to a different style, maybe a more contemporary style versus an older, more classical style. So other contractions that end in int, like isn't or can't, shouldn't, those are less formal sounding. Or I'd or we had, um, contractions ending in VE, we've no less days to sing God's praise. Now, that's an Amazing Grace, which is not really a casual song, but there are some grammatical interesting things there. We've no less days. That's not grammatically correct. It should be we've no fewer days. But that's how the song is written, and the whole song uh, coming together has a certain feel to it. To me, those that contraction and then that grammatic, I would say a mistake there, no less days, at least in our modern language, those to me detract from the song. Not that they make it a bad song, but they do take away from that feel for the song. Or if you have a kind of a double contraction, like I'd have never done such and such, I'd have never thought. Well, that's very informal sounding. It's less refined. Not that this is bad, but that is the tone that you're generating when you use contractions like that. So you just want to factor that in. Is that what you want to do with your song? An example of a song that uses contractions, and to me it stands out, it kind of grabs my attention when they come along, is Oceans, a song by Hillsong. So this song comes from a contemporary Christian, as it's called. That sort of style, that sort of tone, that way of speaking even. You call me out upon the waters, the great unknown where feet may fail. And there I find you in the mystery, in oceans deep my faith will stand. So we note in this first verse that the rhyme structure is not there, that there's not a strong rhythmic structure to it. So this is a particular style of song that is different from older, more classic songs that are sung in church, if you will. And I will call upon your name. So this is a chorus, I guess you would say, and it just jumps in with an and. That gives it a certain kind of a feel, a not casual feel, but it's a almost like a train of thought feel maybe, where it's not a smooth, um, grammatically rigid structure, but it has kind of a flow of thought. And I will call upon your name and keep my eyes above the waves. Here we have what might be a grammatical shortcut. Who keeps my eyes above the waves? Is it me, or is it Jesus keeping my eyes above the waves? When oceans rise, my soul will rest in your embrace, for I am yours and you are mine. The song does not have a really tight imagery here. My soul will rest in your embrace. There is, I think, definitely an image of Jesus calling Peter to step out of the boat and walk to him on the water. So a great figure that, a great reference to a very powerful story in Scripture. But my soul resting in your embrace, for I am yours and you are mine. Those are good thoughts, but they depart from that really staying with that image of walking on the waters. Your grace abounds in deepest waters. Your sovereign hand will be my guide. Where feet may fail and fear surrounds me, you've never failed and you won't start now. So, continuing on with this, all throughout the song, we note that there's a lack of metrical structure or consistent metrical structure or any rhyme, and that sets a certain tone, this contemporary style that fits with that. You've never failed. So there's our contraction that caught my attention in listening to it. You've never failed, and you won't. Now we have won't is one of those contractions that definitely has a stronger push towards a certain style versus I'll or we'll, which is kind of a softer contraction. You won't start now. So we have these contractions that Oceans is the song has kind of a lofty language to it. The great unknown, you call me out upon the waters. When oceans rise, to me these are kind of lofty language type things. But then when you hit these contractions, they are jarring to me personally because I don't listen to a lot of contemporary songs, contemporary Christian songs, if you will. And so that is not what I'm expecting in a song that has lofty language. It might fit better in my mind if that song was more casual all the way through it. So to me, there's a disconnect in that style. You've never failed, and you won't start now. There's another thing going on in this line, along with the contractions. You won't start now. You won't start failing now. That's something I feel like I would say to another person. You've never failed, and you ain't going to start now. That's where it kind of leads me to. That's not what they said, but that's the feeling that I get when I sing this song or when I hear these lyrics. And I will sing the song. It's got a good message. So I'm not detracting from that at all. I'm trying to just illustrate how the word usage affects the style. So you won't start now is kind of a lightities, like we talked about before, as an intentional negative, double negative. You won't start failing now. So failing is negative. You will not fail. You won't start failing now. It's an accurate way of stating a truth, but this case, I think, is more of a little bit complex way of saying it. You won't start failing now. And when we speak in ways that are not refined, as if they're not carefully thought out, we haven't thought them out and say, you know what, there's a clear way to say that, there's a more direct way to say that. I'm just speaking off the top of my head. That's an informal situation. And so I may not say things in the most efficient way possible because I'm just getting them out on the spur of the moment. We might be more likely to say something like this, say it like that in very everyday kind of speech. So this song and this portion of the song has an everyday speech kind of feel to it. That doesn't make it bad. That just is what it is. That's how it feels, at least to me. So for me, in Oceans, there's this combination of lofty language and casual speech that takes me away from the lofty ideas that it's presenting. So, just something to think about in that example. You may love the song, and that's fine. That's great. It's got a good message, and it says good things. The way that it says it is not how I would say it. That's not my style of writing. If it is your style of writing, then go for it. Just understand how that impacts it. Kind of on the other end of the spectrum, really leaning into an older style of speaking, we could go into archaic language. And when I say archaic, what we're talking about is terms, words, or even ways of using grammar that are not in our common speech anymore, or even in our formal speech in church, if you will, unless perhaps someone is praying. Some people pray in more of a formal style, maybe because that's how they either learned to pray or because they're speaking and using language from scripture, and maybe they grew up on the King James version and it uses older styles of speaking from when it was translated. So, of course, we're thinking about words like thee and thou. Once upon a time, thee and thou were intimate words to address someone who is your equal or someone who is lower class, which is interesting because now I think we tend to use it more in religious settings referring to God, and thee and thou and thy. You was a formal way that you would address superiors. You wouldn't say thee or thou to them, but that was back then. Over time, thee and thou and thy became more formal, and maybe it's just because they've faded from common usage. We don't use those in talking to each other, so they're special, they're different. And so we use these special or different terms to talk to God. That might be how someone does that. So songs can be written that way. I think today it's still not too distracting. A very modern song, writing a song today might get people's attention more than an old song that is actually old. Older songs using thee and thou, they're a little bit out of date with our language, our common language. But if they're a classic song, people probably don't get too upset about it. They accept it for what it is. If you're writing a new song, unless you personally feel like you should use them, I would consider not using archaic grammar, because today is probably less accepted or less well received in terms of engagement with the song, because people are further and further away from using those terms. But just think a few years down the road, our society is moving further from those terms and those familiarity with that kind of language. And so that could be even more of a hindrance for someone to pick up your song and engage with it. Similarly, with verbs and having eth or est, thou sayest, thou doeth, those sorts of things, the Shakespearean type of English, if you will, um, those have a similar effect and on the ease of singing your song and understanding and following it and engaging with it. I would just ask, if you want to use archaic grammar, ask yourself why. Is it to just get a particular sound? Is it because you feel that it communicates appropriate reverence? I'm not going to judge you for how you decide that, but just think about it. But I will say this one thing and strongly recommend it, is be consistent. If you're going to use archaic grammar to refer to God, if you will, then stick with it. Don't bounce back and forth. That can be very jarring to someone who, even if they're not mentally paying attention to it, still in the back of their mind, they feel the change from a more modern feel, maybe even a more casual feel or intimate feel, to this very formal, older way of speaking. If it goes back and forth, what is the message there? What is the tone, or what is the style that you're trying to set? So be consistent with whichever way you do it. Which brings us to our example in As the Deer. Depending on what hymnal you use in singing As the Deer, if you're familiar with the hymn, you may see this written differently. In Hymns for Worship, it has been edited to be more consistent and to be more modern, taking away the thee and replacing it with you and so forth. But let's look at the lyrics here. As the deer panteth for the water, so my soul longeth after thee. You alone are my heart's desire, and I long to worship thee. Look in the description for a link to an article that tells the story behind the lyricist who wrote this song. And it comes from Psalm 49, verse 1. As the hart, which is another name for a deer, as the hart panteth after the water brooks, so panteth my soul after thee, O God. So in this verse, we have, as the deer panteth for the water, very directly taken from that passage. So my soul longeth after thee. Longeth or panteth, it's consistent with that use of that archaic way of using those verbs. And after thee instead of after you. It's also consistent with that King James version of Psalm 49, verse 1. That's not the issue I have with it, or that's not what really gets my attention in this song, although it does, those panteths and longeths are kind of a mouthful, and they are archaic. If it was consistent all the way through, then I would say that is what the lyricist is going for. But it's not consistent, and it's not even necessary for rhymes. Sometimes we use thee because we get an E rhyme, and there are a lot of those. But it's neither a true rhyme nor necessary. We could say, as the deer pants for the water. Now, that does something to the meter. It takes a syllable away. So my soul longs after thee, or it longs after you. As the deer pants for the water, so my soul longs for you, or after you. You alone are my heart's desire, and I long to worship you. Now we could comment here on the rhyme using thee or you as the rhyme scheme, which is not a true rhyme, or not the kind of rhyme we're going for. But really what I want to point out is the lyricist uses you. You alone are my heart's desire. Didn't you say, thou alone art my heart's desire? So there's an inconsistency in the way that it's written. So I would say in your song, if you're going to pick one, go with it all the way. Stick with it. Be true to that style. In the chorus, you alone are my strength, my shield. To you alone may my spirit yield. You alone are my heart's desire. So in the chorus, you, and then, and I long to worship thee. Why not just stick with you there? So that's the point that I want to point out here. In the original version of As the Deer, there's a lot of inconsistencies as to whether it's using archaic language or not. Skipping verse 2, let's look at verse 3. You're my friend, and you are my brother, even though you are a king. I love you more than any other, so much more than anything. Verse 3 to me is very different from the rest of the song, especially when you factor in the archaic language from verse 1 and the little bit of archaic language at the end of the chorus. Now we have a contraction, you're my friend, but we know that contraction isn't consistently used because it immediately says, and you are my brother. So it's not used stylistically, at least not consistently so. You've got you're my friend and you're my brother, or you are my friend, you are my brother. If we want to be more formal, then we would not use the contraction. If we want to be less formal, we would use it. Going back and forth is just kind of unsettling, likely to get the syllables. So sometimes we'd make choices to get the meter and the rhythm right or consistent. We want to, where possible, do that without compromising the consistency of the tone and the style. Even though you are a king. Now, one thing this does, and I kind of like it in a way, it's effective anyway. You're my friend, and you are my brother. So the song starts out, first verse is very reverential, I guess. It has this formal style. I long to worship thee, and it's us down here and God up there. Now we get to that's a verse 1. In verse 3, you're my friend. Now we're using a contraction and we're talking to God or Jesus as our friend. That's consistent. We want to establish a familiar feeling. We use a contraction, and that's the topic that's being talked about. You're my friend, You're my brother. You're beside me. And that's the point that this verse is making. You're beside me, even though you are a king. So he might could have even done, you're my friend and you're my brother, even though thou art a king, to kind of emphasize the kingly, formal way that you would address a king. Then we have the last part of this verse, I love you more than any other, so much more than anything. It's good to say that we love God more than anything. To me, it kind of rings empty. There's this beautiful image from Psalm 49, verse 1 in the first verse. As the deer pants for the water, so my soul longs after you. That's a very vivid image. But then in verse 3, it ends with, I love you more than any other, so much more than anything. That's a good sentiment, but it doesn't engage me very much. Not even as much as the first half of that verse. You're my friend, even though you're a king. That's a good contrast there. So I'm not trying to critique any of these songs. I'm just pointing out how they're using language, how they're using figures, how they're using grammar, whether it's current or archaic, and the effect that has on me as an individual. And that's something for you to consider as you write your song as to what effect it might have on the listener and on the singer. Now, moving on from archaic language and modern language, let's talk about the words that we use and how big or how fancy they should be. We talked in the last lesson about words that have impact or loaded terms. We did mention that not all loaded terms are big terms. They're just terms that carry a lot of weight with them. But for a young writer, especially one who is actually young in age, who sings a lot of songs written by older, more mature Christians, people who have life experience and have ways of expressing themselves that are eloquent and deep and profound, they may want to express that same amount of weight. And that can be tough when your life has not gone through all the real experiences and carried all the weight that a more mature person has carried. So to overcome that or to represent a mature sound, you may be tempted to use bigger words. And there's a certain logic to that. A very small child uses very small words, and as they grow up, they're more able to use a lot of different words, nuanced words that capture more exactly what they want to communicate. But this is how we think it works. As our maturity of writing skill increases, then we're going to use more fancy words, bigger words, more elegant words. And that just continues up as we go along to where a very mature writer is going to be writing in very beautiful, flowing, lofty language and big words and just words that we wouldn't even think about using, and they're just so perfect. But in my opinion, writing looks more like this. When you begin writing as a young writer, a person who is young, you may not have a lot of big words to use. And so you write very simply. And that's pretty good, actually. But people may recognize, yes, this is probably written by a young person. And you know what? That's okay. You keep writing as long as God gives you the ability. Keep writing, keep growing in your ability to affect others with your songs and express yourself through your songs. But as your maturity increases, as your experience increases in writing and in life in general, you'll probably start to write with more complex words, finding more fancy and nuanced and expressive words. And you'll keep doing that. But after a while, you'll come to realize that you don't have to do that. That you can express very profound truths with very simple words. And those simple words help people to pay attention to the message rather than the words themselves. If someone says, "Ooh, that's a neat word," they've lost track of what you've been trying to get them to think about. And then they started paying attention to the words. In movies, what they want to do with the music is for you to never notice it, but for it to move you as the story unfolds. And so that's the balance that they try to strike, where it's just right there in the back of your mind. It's definitely there in the back of your mind, and it's moving you and it's powerful, but it's not enough to distract you and take you out of the movie and start saying, "Oh, I'm listening to an orchestra right now." So you want people singing your songs to be moved by the words, but not to be paying attention to how good of a wordsmith you are, but to how important the message is. So over time, you may come back down and use fewer fancy words, but communicate more powerful and deeper thoughts. Kind of continuing in the same train of thought, just comparing everyday words to quote unquote church words, or words that we don't really use outside of a worship setting or a church setting, or even a Bible or spiritual discussion setting. Now, I enter into this topic knowing that there are certain words that need to be used because they're spiritual. They describe spiritual things. And so we can't just avoid using those words. And there's also an aspect of maybe we should be using those words in everyday and not just in church. So taking all that and not discounting any of that, just thinking about how we balance when we're writing a song. Should the song be written more like the original King James version with archaic language and formal writing? Or should it be more like the Message, which is, as a translation, if you will, it's very informal. Even in the style of it is less formal. It's more casual and everyday. A further departure from, as a translation, from the original for sure. But really, I'm just talking about the styles here, not the value of the translation. Some figures or terms may trivialize the holy, things that are holy and sacred and should be set apart. For instance, we could have the line, "God, I love you more than I love PB and J." Well, what's wrong with that? Is anything wrong with that? It might depend on who's writing it, for sure. First, is it true? Do I love God more than I love peanut butter and jelly? Actually, let me correct that. That's kind of formal to say it all out. PB&J is less formal than peanut butter and jelly. So do I love God more than I love PB&J? I certainly hope so. But does that comparison merit being put into a song? Shouldn't we be comparing our love for God to something that is also a very strong love? So does this comparison treat God as holy, even though it says, I love him more than this thing? Is it bringing him down to say, I love you more than this thing that's just, whatever? I guess it just depends on how much you love PB&J. Like if somebody's really obsessed about it, then for them, and probably not for many people, that could be a very strong sentiment. And maybe if it's a very young child, this could be a very good line. But for most people, most adults, this is going to take God down a long way to even attempt to compare him and our love for him to our love for some piece of food. Now, compare that to, as the deer pants for the water, so my soul longs after you. In a way, that's the same comparison. In fact, it's saying it's the same way that not even stepping our desire for God above that, it's saying it's the same. It's a metaphor, right? Or it's a simile, using as the deer does that. As newborn babes, desire the pure milk of the word, that you may grow thereby. So the Bible uses these comparisons, but it's the way that we say it, right? We can see a difference between that, as the deer pants for the water, and I love you more than I love PB&J. There's not a hard and fast rule on that. It's just something that we can kind of sense, and it's something to think about. What effect will that have on your audience? Will it trivialize the topic or not? On the other hand, using a lot of terms that are uncommon outside of church, if you will, can create a barrier to some. We want to be reverent, at all times reverent, but not pretentious, not to make ourselves sound sophisticated like the Pharisee who saw the tax collector and was so grateful he wasn't like that man. We don't want to be like that, but we do want to be reverent. We don't want to change the message when we're making this decision in terms of Should it be more common words or less common words that we use more in church settings? We don't want to change the message that's important, but we do want to choose words to express it that will work best for the intended audience. So, with that, we want to consider our purpose and our audience. We go back to the DNA of our song. An invitation song that's supposed to appeal to a sinner and somebody just coming out of the world, came right in off the street, and they've got a very rough life, not much religious background. They don't know the New Testament from the Old Testament. They just heard the basics of the gospel, and we want them to come and respond to the gospel call. We're going to have to keep that language very common if we want to appeal to that person, because if we start throwing a bunch of terms they don't even know, then that won't help encourage them to respond to the gospel. On the other hand, if you have an invitation song that is appealing to someone who has been in the pews for decades, but they need a fire reignited in their soul, their love has grown cold and it needs to be rekindled, you can use words that are more religious in nature and something that they would have heard many times over the decades. You can use them in that situation. You may still find it beneficial to stick to more common words, but those would be something that could still appeal to that person and would resonate with them. So it depends on your audience as to which way you want to go with favoring common words versus favoring words that are mostly just used in a religious context. Thinking back to Jesus and how he taught, he used parables, just stories and comparisons. And he also quoted scripture. So he did both things. And he did that to teach important truths. No matter how he did it, he was always teaching important truths in very profound ways. And he did it. He taught tax collectors and sinners, and he taught the religious elite among the Pharisees and Sadducees and so forth. All of those religious leaders, he taught all kinds, and he used different methods to reach them. The next thing I want to look at is accessibility or readability. There are different aspects to our audience, whether it's someone who has a deep religious background or someone who doesn't have much at all. But we also could think about the educational level of the audience and what they can process because of their education, because of their experience, or just their level of maturity. If we're writing a song for children, then we want to keep the song, we want to use words in that song that are known by the children and easily grasped by them. So how do we judge how we're doing with that? We know we've got our target audience in mind and we're just wondering, should I use this word or not? There are some tools out there that can help give you an idea of how accessible your song is to different grade levels or so forth. I'll have a link in the description for readabilityformulas.com. You can go there and paste in your poetry. Make sure that it's punctuated like you would if you were writing prose, and paste that in, and it will give you different scores. So you've got the Flesh reading ease score, and if we look at the song "Trust and Obey," you can look that up fairly easy online. It has a score of 87. It's easy to read. Gunning Fog has a 9 on the text scale, fairly easy to read. This is just the report that you get out from Readability Formulas. And on that website or online in general, you can go and dig into these more if you're really interested in this. Flesh Kincaid has a grade level of 7th grade, whereas the Coleman-Liao Index has a grade level of 3. Smog Index, 3rd grade. Automated Readability Index, 5th to 6th grade, for 10 to 11 years old. The Lincier Wright Formula is 11th grade. So you can see that these reports are a wide spectrum from 3rd grade up to 11th grade. What does that mean? Well, these are just calculations, really, and they take different factors into account to estimate the ease of reading the piece that has been analyzed. Some of them take the length of words and weight them differently. They take how common words are or uncommon they are. And so you really have to understand the scale to understand what it's telling you about the difficulty of what you've written. Then you can kind of combine these different scales, combine 7 different readability scales. You get a grade level of 6, reading level that's easy to read, and the age of the reader, 10 to 11 years old. And you want to think about that in terms of your target audience. You may have 5-year-olds who can read and who can sing your song. Do you require that your song speaks to them in a way that they can understand and appreciate? If so, you have to write your song a certain way. But think about your purpose and what you're trying to accomplish. Are you dealing with a topic that they will even understand? If they don't understand the topic, they won't be able to apply the words, even if they know what the words are. So, if it's a topic dealing with adult type issues and adult level emotions, then you may want to use words that a 5-year-old can pronounce and be familiar with or familiarize themselves with, but understand that they won't really be able to appreciate the song until they're a good bit older. Maybe they have it in the back of their mind and it's useful to them once they grow up. But don't try to force a song that is for a mature audience into complete understandability by a 5-year-old. You're going to lose your older audience if you have to simplify it that much. So just decide what balance you want to strike based on the purpose, the topic, and the target audience for your song. Continuing on with Trust and Obey, we have the new Dale-Chall Readability Index, another index of readability. We have another link for that. This uses a list of common words. It uses sentence length and it uses word length to calculate readability. With this index, you get a grade 5 to 6, but we get some details out of this, and I think this is what's especially useful to me. It will tell you how many words are not on this list. So they created a list of common words, and if a word isn't on there, then it starts to increase the ranking of the song in the readability level. It's going to be more difficult to read. And you look at that as a number of words. There's 11 words in Trust and Obey. Percentage of all the words, that also affects readability. If it's 11 words out of 12, that's going to be hard to read. But if it's just 5% of all the words, then that's not so bad. Words not on the Dale-Chall word list. So when you pull that up, that is something that really helps you judge better the impact of those words. So what might not be a common word in an everyday audience may be a very common word in a religious audience. Abides, skies. Well, skies isn't on that list, but do you think a 5-year-old knows what skies are or the sky? Yeah, probably so. So that one probably shouldn't cause you too much trouble or feel like you're really using too complex of words. Doubt. That's a mature idea, but it's not an uncommon word. Abide, again, variation on abides. Burden, richly, grief, blessed. Now, blessed or altar, those are a couple of words that are uncommon outside of religious circles, but are pretty common inside of an assembly of people who regularly read the Bible or hear Bible stories or hear sermons and so forth. Bestows, that's probably the one that's most uncommon on this list, even among religious people. That means to give to someone, and you may be able to pick that out from the context. But see, when you're thinking about your song and word choice, if you have a difficult word, but it's in a very clear context, and even if it was a made up word, people would know what it meant because of the context, then you don't have to worry about it too much. But if understanding the meaning of one word really changes the meaning of the song, and it's not clear from the context what that word means, then you may want to be more careful about what word you put there, making sure that it's one that people know. And of course, Jesus. Most of the children singing your song will already know about Jesus, so that word shouldn't increase the level of difficulty for them. If anything, it makes it more familiar. You have word length. The song has a lot of shorter words. There's one 3-syllable word, fellowship. So fellowship is not a word we use a lot in everyday language, but it's common enough in a setting of religious people who are joined together in worship and harmony and working together. In other words, they're joined together in fellowship. So they'll probably know what that word means or be able to relate to it pretty well. Another example we have, readability, still focusing on this new Dale-Chall readability index, is When I Survey the Wondrous Cross. This one has a little higher grade level. Grade 7 through 8 has 13 words not found on the Dale-Chall word list, so just 2 more than trust and obey. And just thinking back to trust and obey, we've got some young kids at church that really belt that song out. They love it so much. And that gives you an idea of how that readability index connects with the kids. Now, do they fully understand every implication of that song? Probably not. But they have it in their hearts and their minds, and they'll understand it better as they grow older and be able to apply it more as they mature. The percent of words not found on the Dale-Chall word list for When I Survey the Wondrous Cross is 12%. So it's more than double the percentage-wise just because of the number of words. Words not on the list: survey, wondrous, richest, pride, forbid, boast, sacrifice, mingled, compose, realm, amazing, divine, demands. This song is going to be for an audience that has a bit bigger vocabulary. And it uses some words in ways that we don't use them that much. Or thorns compose so rich a crown. We don't usually use compose in that way. We would think of composing as something that we would do with music or maybe words. A composer, we're very familiar with that term for like movie scores and so forth. Or composition, something goes in, but composition is a big word that most people just don't use all the time. So thorns composing a rich crown. You have to chew on that a little bit. It's a very powerful image, but the way that it is stated, it's an older song. It states things a way that we don't speak that way that much anymore. And so you have to meditate on it a little bit more. It does increase the difficulty of the song, but would you change it? Maybe not. It would be difficult to change it without losing some of the power of it. Maybe part of that is just because it's an older song and that kind of speaks to us sometimes. Now let's look at some qualities of songs that are kind of established by the word choices. We mentioned accessibility. Will everyone understand it? And that's one way of looking at that aspect, but diving into it deeper, will they be able to understand it quickly? And will they be able to understand it without studying it, having to go look it up? What does this word mean? What is this context for this phrase that's taken from some passage? I didn't even know it was from a passage. All those things, if you're expecting someone to have to really dig in and study to understand your song, understand that's going to limit how accessible it is. Or if you use a figure in such a way, or you say something in a certain way that, yes, it can be understood, it is grammatically possible that it communicates the right meaning, but really you have to explain it to people for them to get it, then that's going to limit the effectiveness of the song anytime that you can't go and explain it. This is one of the differences between writing a song and writing a sermon. In a sermon, you get to explain. You say a phrase and you get to expound on that and explain the nuance of what you meant, what you didn't mean. But in a song, you don't have all that. So you want your song to be self-explanatory and not need a separate lesson to tell people what it means. With accessibility, there's the aspect of comprehension, but there's also the aspect of being able to relate to it. Is it a problem that many people deal with or that your target audience deals with specifically? There's a song that says, how sweet to hold our newborn baby. There's a variant on that song that says, "How sweet to hold a newborn baby." Those two phrases are extremely different in how relatable they are. Because if you've never had a newborn baby of your own, then you can't relate to that except in a intellectual way. You can't personally relate to it. But if you hold a newborn baby, your your aunt or uncle's newborn baby, or your brother or sister's newborn baby, or it is your brother or sister, like you can relate to holding a baby more likely than to holding your own, unless you're grown and you have your own children. But there's a lot of people who sing songs who have never had children. So that is narrowing the relatability of that song in that particular phrase. So, can you relate to it? Can everyone sing it and mean it? I mean, that's a tough one. If the song very specifically refers to a situation that people are not in or have never been in, even if they can relate to it, they can't actually sing it truthfully for themselves. Now, this is poetry, so you could say, yes, they can sing it understanding they're not declaring they've actually done that thing, but they're speaking sympathetically. That's okay, but it's not powerful. Not as powerful as it can be if they can really relate to it. So, that is the reality of relatability of a song. What you have to decide is this message that may be specific or unrelatable to some, is it important enough that I still want to write that in my song because some people have never sung this in a song and they need it? Go ahead and write it. That's just an awareness you want to have of your song. If you're writing about, I've written a song about losing a child either before they're born or very young in life. Lots of people don't have firsthand experience in that. Gratefully so, wonderfully so. But for those who do, there aren't many songs that help them specifically with that problem to mourn with them and to comfort and encourage them. So there is a more limited relatability, but a bigger impact because it is more specific. So that again, you're writing your song, you decide how those things should be weighted as you make choices about relatability. Clarity, similar to accessibility, will everyone easily understand it the same? So it may be that lots of people can sing your song, read your song, and understand it, and they will understand it in different ways. So clarity, does this mean, can someone get some meaning out of it? That's accessibility. Can they get the meaning I intend for them to get from it and be unified in understanding as they sing? That's clarity. Don't be defensive about this. You want to be very open to feedback on this topic because you can't change how people react to your song. You may want them to react a certain way, but you can't change how they do. And in thinking about clarity, you want to ask the question, is the correct understanding merely possible? You could, if you have to argue with someone and say, look, this is what it means. Look how I wrote it here. If you have to argue with them, that means the meaning may be possible, but it's not obvious and it's not inescapable to the target audience. So think about your target audience, maybe talk to your target audience and say, read this, tell me what you think it means. And if they tell you something different from what you wanted them to get from it, then you may need to adjust it. Poignancy or power. Do my individual words have impact? Going back to those loaded terms, however they look, fancy or not, do they have impact? Are my figures meaningful and powerful? Accuracy, kind of going along with clarity and understanding and so forth, is not so much what does the person get, but what am I writing down? Is what I'm writing down even accurate and true? Did I get captivated by a word or a figure and lose track of what I should be saying? That's happened to me before. I was like, wow, that's a powerful figure, and I get carried away with that figure, and then take a step back, maybe set it aside and come back to it and realize that's not true. It's powerful, but it's not true. And so those things need to be corrected or adjusted. Maybe you can still use the figure, but tweak it a little bit to where it's not communicating something that's a little bit off base. Coming back now tying that into clarity, how hard will someone have to work to make the message true? Sometimes, again, we can say, yes, this is true. See, for this reason and this reason and this reason. And the singer's like, that's a big stretch to get there. I have to work hard to make that be true when I sing it, like go through a lot of mental gymnastics. On the other hand, there will always be someone who can take your words and think about them in a certain way, in a certain light, with a certain background and context and meaning among multiple meanings of words, and take something true that you wrote and make it false. Does that mean that you should change what you write? I say absolutely not, because even the words of Jesus were taken and abused, and yet he spoke them the way that he intended to speak them. So we can't always communicate in a way that no one will ever take our song and go the wrong direction with it. What we want to ask ourselves is, how hard is that? Do they really have to work at it? Or is it really easy to slip from this figurative language to take it literal, and now it means something way wrong? We want to look at that and say, okay, if that's possible, how clear is it that I'm using figurative language? Is it ambiguous? Is it, yeah, I don't know. I don't know if this person believes in the truth or not when someone's reading your song. Or do they read your song, they sing your song, and they say, this is what I think it means. It might mean something else, but you know what? I can sing the truth with this song pretty easily. I suspect that happens a lot with songs that I might disagree with the author on doctrinal issues, maybe even things that they say in their song, that I can, knowing their background and their religious affiliations and so forth, I have strong suspicions about what they might have been thinking when they wrote certain words. But those words have meaning that can be true or can carry a different connotation or different context than the author might have had in mind. And I can easily sing those with what I believe to be true from reading the scriptures. And so there's definitely a lot of room for interpretation there. Don't over worry about how someone might twist your song. Just try to make it easy to sing right and true, and then let people use their own knowledge and their own understanding of Scripture to come to that song honestly and fairly and be able to sing it with that truth. Final quality we want to think about with word choice is balance. We want to balance impact with strong, powerful words, with readability, with words that are accessible. We want to balance between a deep figure that on paper may be really good when you're just reading it and you read the line multiple times and you think about it and you turn it around in your mind and you're like, wow, this is really deep. But when you're singing a song, just remember you've got seconds, maybe fractions of a second to think about something before you have to move on to the next line. So if it's buried too deep, then it may be difficult to understand. But if it's too shallow, it may not carry much weight. So what's really nice is if you can write lyrics that are easy to grasp, but have a lot of depth the longer you think about them. Not that you have to think about them a long time before you even understand them. That's how Scripture is. There's so much of Scripture that we can understand very easily when we read it, but just the longer we study it, the more we recognize is there that we didn't see at first. And yet it didn't mean that we had to spend years before we could even scratch the surface or start to understand a simple statement. One way that you can do this, strike a good balance, is have someone read your lyrics and give you their instant feedback, because that's what it will be like for someone singing your song, especially for the first time. What does the person think it means? So have them read your lyrics and immediately tell you what they think it means, not ponder over it for a long time. Ask them, what do they take away from it? Like, what benefit do they get from it? Or what is the message that they get from it? And ask them, what do they think the purpose is? Why do they think you wrote the song? You might see that your purpose didn't come through in the message. And that's a good way to get some feedback on how someone, at least one person, might perceive your song and might receive your song. So with all of these considerations in mind from this lesson and from the poetic language lesson previously. How do we decide which words to use? Number one, don't feel obligated to talk fancy. Remember, loaded terms, powerful terms are not always fancy, unusual, or big. That's not a requirement for a good song. In fact, you could probably take a good song and mess it up by using too many big words. The story told is more important than the individual words. Obviously, stories are made up of words, and every word is important, but no single word is more important than the overall message. Individual words, word choice, can either add to the story, can build it up, can strengthen it, or it can detract or distract from the message. And then think about being consistent in style. Does an informal style fit the message? If it does, be consistent that way and don't drift into really lofty and elaborate language that doesn't fit your style. Consider the point of view and target audience when you think about what should my style be and how do I establish that. If you're addressing God, that doesn't mean that you have to use a certain style, but the way that you address him might. So if you're addressing God as your Abba, as your father, as a child whose father is holding them in their arms, you're probably going to want to use different words than if you were drawing the picture of you falling before the throne of the Almighty. Both of those are proper and good perspectives of God, but one of them is more familiar and is going to have probably a less formal tone, a more familial tone to it than the other, which is more distant because God is far above us in his might and authority and righteousness, although he is very near to us in his love and his compassion. So that's the balance that you have to strike there with familiar versus reverent or awestruck type language. If we're talking to others, addressing others in our song, this horizontal communication, we can also think about similarly, is it formal or is it informal? If we're calling people to come up to higher things, to the things of Christ, and we're saying, come out of that place and set your eyes, look up and move towards God, then we may want more formal language, maybe. But if we want to be more sympathetic with someone and we want to communicate, look, I have been where you are and it's tough. I know your sorrows. I know your challenges. I know how difficult it is to overcome sin. If all we're doing is talking in big lofty language and big words, it'll sound like we're talking down to someone. Like, I am more righteous than you, and you need to stop being the way you are so that you can be as righteous as I am. We never want to communicate that idea. So if we are there and we're bearing someone that we're putting our hand, we're putting our arms under their shoulder and we're lifting them up off the ground, then we're going to use words that are just very intimate and familiar and probably less formal because we don't want to set ourselves up as being better than them on our own merits. But if we're saying, look, we've got to strive for greater things than we're doing right now, we need to be up there. We need to be pushing towards Christ. We might use more formal language to express that idea of let's be better. Let's not just stay where we are. So that's word choice. Assignment number 9 is to write another verse in poetry. So this would be your second verse written in poetic language, still not necessarily focusing on rhythm and rhyme. We'll get to those really soon in upcoming lessons, but trying to get another verse where you're focused on word choice and selecting your figures and so forth with the considerations from this lesson and the previous lesson. Think about poetic language with loaded terms, figures of speech, and repetition. Think about readability now. Look at the details of your readability scores. Take the writing that you've done and plug it into those websites and see what kind of reports you get back. And read through. Are there certain words that are identified by those analyses that are actually difficult, that nobody really uses, it just fit just right? Well, maybe we don't want to use that because it would distract from the message. But sometimes it's just words, like we noted, that will be familiar to most people that will be singing the song. Think about your style and decide what style I'm going to use. Do I want to be more formal or do I want to be more familiar? Do I want to be more modern, current, or contemporary, just using up to date language? Or am I more comfortable with, or would my message better come across using an old school way of speaking? But whatever you do, you want to be consistent to marry your style with your message and your purpose. That's it for lesson 9 of the Young Writer series. I want this series to be useful to anyone interested in writing a hymn, so please give me feedback in the comments. Up next is lesson 10, starting over. If you haven't yet, you may soon feel that your song is just an empty shell. It's got good form on the outside and a solid structure, but has no heart or soul to it. And this process that we've been going through has just sucked the life out of it. You may have lost touch with the very important reason you wanted to write in the first place. If you feel kind of like the Ephesians in Revelation 2, like your songwriting has left its first love, lesson 10 will hopefully help you remember from where you have fallen and get back to the motivation and passion that you had at first. But don't be surprised if that means a bit of an overhaul for your song. The good news is, though, even if you have to do that, if you have to make drastic changes to get it back to where you want it to be, this is where your writing efforts are about to turn a corner, and you will really see your message and your song taking shape and getting a glimpse of what you will have at the end when you're finished. Thank you for watching, and may the words of your mouth and the meditation of your heart be acceptable in the sight of the Lord.